let's jump right in. Occlusal orthotics. Let's be honest, most of us have been trained that it's just a night guard. It's just a piece of plastic. But we still have 650 people signed up to find out otherwise. So let's just jump right into it. And when we talk about occlusal orthotics, I'm really going to break it down into 5 areas. Why we're doing them, and I'm going to come at it from a very intention-based approach. Then I want to talk about joint position, and people get really freaked out about anterior open bites and CR and centric relation. So let's demystify it and just throw that out on the floor. I'd like to talk about different designs, the benefits and considerations of them, also really tied into the first point, why we're actually using them. We'll talk about some basic records. And finally, lastly, I'd really like to talk about how to screen for and avoid unwanted occlusal changes. That is the dreaded anterior open bite. I've actually been a defense witness for anterior open bites with orthotics. If you can think about the weirdest job description that is about as niche as it gets, that's it. So let's start with intention-based orthotic therapy. Now, if all or any of these patients came into your practice, I would say, how would you treat them? What sort of concerns would you have? What would you bring up with them? What sort of appliance or orthotic would you recommend? I'll tell you, I've seen just about every piece of plastic go into someone's mouth that is even possible. And believe it or not, I even have a box in my office called the box of shame. And this box of shame contains different orthotics and different designs that have come in with patients over the years, and some that I've even provided. Now, if you look at some of those, you can see leaf gauges, you can see soft guards, you can see tanners, you can see universals, you can see some NTIs in there. And it's not that there's anything wrong with any of those appliances. It's much more so why they were used and if they were being used appropriately. So if I think about process versus purpose, that is how we do something versus why we do something, that really changes my focus on how I approach splint or orthotic therapy. And I'd like to introduce you to a patient, and his name is Dave. So if you look at Dave, I'm sure some of you are already treatment planning him. You might be concerned about his gum tissue and the inflammation or the calculus or the color or the wear. And all of those are tainted by our own history, our own personal preferences as patients, as clinicians. But as you see on each side of the screen, sometimes we see death and danger and destruction on the left side of the screen, but on the right side of the screen, the patient might not see anything wrong. In fact, that's the same beachhead in Australia on the Great Southern Ocean. But when Dave came in to see me, I said, "Hi, I'm Mike." He said, "Hi, I'm Dave." I said, "What brings you in today and what can I do for you?" And he said, "Well, the last guy wanted to crown all my teeth." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Well, the guy before that wanted to cut my gums, then crown my teeth." I said, "Okay." And he said, "The guy before that wanted to move my teeth, cut my gums, then crown all my teeth." And I said, "Okay, Dave, what brings you into my office?" And after a little bit of detente and staring at each other, he actually pounded his fist on my desk and he said, "I can't eat. I can't eat." He said, "I have yellow teeth. You see them. I see them. All those other dentists see these and they wanted to do all these procedures, but I can't eat." And I said, "Dave, what can I do for you?" And he said, "Can you make it so it doesn't hurt when I eat?" So I went through the whole exam, and I know we're just on a short webinar, but this was just really an occlusal muscle thing. And Dave had so much muscle pain from his grinding and his clenching that led to his tooth destruction. So I went ahead and made him this appliance. And if I asked you what that is, many of you would say an NTI. And it is and it isn't. The process is an NTI, but the purpose is make it so it doesn't hurt when I eat. And Dave wore this and he came back a couple days later and he says, I can't wear this. And I said, "What's going on?" He says, I'm going to swallow it. It scares me. It's too small." So we switched gears and I made Dave one of these. And you might think, well, that's a flat plane appliance. Again, that's the process. The purpose remains the same, is let's make it so Dave doesn't hurt when he eats. And things were pretty good with Dave, and life was good. And he was wearing this orthotic, beating it up, as you can see on the right side of the screen. And slowly his muscle pain resolved so that he could eat and it didn't hurt when he ate. And that was his whole purpose of why he wanted to come in. But at some point, Dave came back and he says, I have a little sharp spot on the appliance. And I said, where's the sharp spot? And he pulled this out of his pocket. And I said, where's the other part of the sharp spot, Dave? And he pulled out the little smaller piece. And he says, this is bad, huh? And I said, yeah, this is bad. And he goes, huh. He says, well, couldn't you just smooth off the sharp spot? And I said, yeah, Dave, but on the other side, you have another sharp spot that is starting to break. And then Dave said, oh, that's bad. And what Dave came up with, he said, well, why don't you just cut both sides of the back off like you had for that first appliance that you gave me? And we did that. And while this isn't an NTI and it isn't a full splint, it's kind of a combination of both designs. But Dave was still happy because not much has changed, because his goal was to make it so it doesn't hurt when he eats. So when I think about types of appliance therapy, I can think about NTIs, Tanners, mandibular full arch uppers, segmentals, appliance. But really what I want to think about, what is appropriate, whether it's Botox, Medrol dose pack, physiotherapy, massage therapy, to help Dave make it so it doesn't hurt when he eats. So if I could break orthotic therapy down into kind of 4 categories, I have to look at the different types of patients that walk into my office. And one says, I want the smile back that was stolen from me. One says, like Dave, I can't eat. Another says, the pain is unbearable. And another one says, can you kind of just help me from busting up my teeth until I have enough money to take care of them? And the interesting thing was, after Dave was done, he wanted to address his short, ugly yellow teeth. But the primary concern that he has was pain. And when I group orthotics into different types, people might think of designs, but I think of intention: protective, palliative, and diagnostic. If something is hurting, whether it's teeth or muscles or joints, I'd like to help get people out of pain, palliative. Now, if people are destroying their teeth or damaging their joints or damaging crowns, we'd like to look at those appliances as being protective. So we have protective orthotic therapy, we have palliative orthotic therapy, and finally, we have diagnostic orthotic therapy. Is the appliance actually protecting? Is there daytime or diurnal? Is there perhaps environmental? Is it erosive? Are they farmers? Is there a lot of dust? Palliative diagnostic: is the appliance actually taking care of the pain? Is it affecting it in any way? I know Dr. Lee Brady, one of my good friends and dear mentors, says when she delivers an appliance, things may get better, things may get worse, or things may stay the same. And they'll all give us valuable information. And finally, diagnostic can be about joint position. Is that if we want the joint to seat, it perhaps pre-restoratively in wear patient, it can actually open up space for restorative room. So palliative, protective, and diagnostic. That is the part, regardless of any treatment that I look at, I want to talk about the purpose before we talk about the process. And that wraps up my first point about the intention-based orthotic therapy. And I was just getting to that. So I'd like to talk a little bit and understand how and when joint position is relevant. So some people are saying, oh, I don't want to deal with occlusion. I don't want to deal with that CR stuff. And that's sort of like saying, well, I don't want to deal with gravity. And whether we like gravity or not, whether we like a seated joint position or not, patients do go there. And just going over a little bit of terminology just quickly, CO, that is centric occlusion, is the first tooth that touches when a patient is in centric relation. Centric relation is purely a joint position. So that is the most seated joint position. I know there's a million different definitions, and those definitions have changed 29 times over the last 100 years. So let's think about a CR or seated position is where the mandible or where the condyle goes when the muscles are at their highest level of activity. That is when the temporalis and masseter win out over everything, when all the destructive forces are in place, that's when the condyle goes. But it can also be where the condyle goes when the muscles are at their most relaxed. So that gets into pre-restorative. But looking at those two positions, we also have to bring up a third position, which is MIP, or maximum intercuspation position. So MIP is irrelevant or regardless of joint position. It is teeth together. CR, or centric relation, is irrelevant or regardless of teeth. Don't even need any teeth. It is purely about a seated joint position. So if we look at those two, with centric relation being that seated joint position and MIP being teeth together, those are really two of the choices that will frequently come in when we talk about orthotic design, and we also talk about orthotic records. So if we fabricate a orthotic in centric relation, that is, when the joint is fully seated, we fabricate an orthotic in that position, and that jaw can be hinged a little bit more open for adequate acrylic room. Everything that happens from there going in any movement is going to be anterior guidance anterior of the joint. So it may be group function, it may be canine initiated disclusion, but when we look at that, what we're really looking at is we have distribution throughout the arch, that is all the dots that you're seeing there, and then we have lines. The lines can be laterotrusive with a canine guidance. They can be protrusive on the centrals, but let's just look at how that might look if an upper or Michigan splint was placed. And as the joint seats, then we have distribution throughout the arch. The patient can close, and at 100% muscle activity, all that load is distributed throughout the appliance. They can go into protrusive at 30%, and they can go into laterotrusive at 70% temporalis and masseter activity, going into a position we call crossover. Now, what if we took that same piece of plastic, but we designed it this time just from an MIP position? So we just sent the lab MIP records, and we didn't really consider where the joint is. The challenge with that is if the patient actually goes to a seated position from MIP, they'll only be hitting on the sevens or the second molars. That is where we see damage on second molars in the natural dentition, where we see our crowns breaking when we don't have an orthotic in there. But when an orthotic is in place, as we saw with Dave, if that MIP appliance, or perhaps we're not able to get a patient into CR during our initial records, we can start to see damage where we just have contact in that second molar area. And that might be part of the process that if we can't actually get someone to CR, the appliance is part of our journey towards that centric relation position. What I'll also say, if this is a protective appliance, Dave is damaging the appliance instead of his teeth. So yes, it might be damaged, and a patient comes in, look, your orthotic broke. And I said, are your teeth okay? And they say, yeah. I said, good, then it did its job. The orthotic is supposed to take the damage instead of your teeth. And I'll even say that you don't get upset when you get in a car accident and your airbag deploys. Your airbag saves your life, your orthotic saves your teeth. So next, we've gone through intention-based orthotic therapy. We've talked about joint position a little bit. Now I'd like to talk about the benefits and considerations of various designs, these being full and partial coverage. So looking at the splint that I previously showed, you can see it with the photoshopped marks in on the right side of the screen and the actual marks there on this clear appliance. This is an upper appliance. So as they go into protrusion, the lines will go forward on the centrals. As they go into lateral, they will go left and right, and black dots in distribution. So looking at that one more time with the orthotic coming into the mouth, We can see that again going on the upper arch. And notice there that they hit on the front teeth first. Maybe in our records, we used a leaf gauge to force seat the condyle and sent those records off to Burbank. But when we put it into the patient's mouth, they don't go to a seated position right away, and they might only hit on the front of the appliance. The appliance then acts as an anterior deprogrammer. And I'm going to back that up and play that one more time so you can kind of follow along. So there we put it in, they're in protrusion, 70% muscle activity, the masseter and temporalis is calmed down, and they go to that seated position where we actually had the lab design this distribution throughout the arch, reduction in shear in motion. Looking at that, what you see is the left side of the screen at delivery, where on the right side of the screen, you could look at that as being the skull, or the right side of the screen, you could look at that as being the articulator. If we force that position with the leaf gauge, but that little blue muscle there, the lateral pterygoid, wasn't real thrilled about being forced to that seated position, the left side of the screen might be how that looks at delivery. Now you could elect to grind down the front so it hit everywhere, or you could add acrylic to the back or resin so it hit everywhere, or you could just let the orthotic do its job, anterior only teeth touching, and you would have a reduction down to 30% muscle activity, which allows the jaw to seat. Now, bringing that up, that 30% muscle activity, Dr. Becker, Zambrano, and Tarantola did a study that was published in JPD back in 1999, I believe, and that they showed that the use of a modified anterior midpoint stop appliance reduced voluntary clenching activity to 1/3 of maximum. Now, if any of you have been to any of my lectures at the CDA, perhaps I know Burbank being in California, or at the ADA, the AGD, at Pankey, wherever, you've seen me do the finger biting exercise where I have you bite on your fingernail on your second molars and then on your canine and then on your anterior teeth. And I won't do that tonight on the webinar, but what I will say is that on the far left side of the screen, if you clench your teeth all together really hard, that's MIP. Now, if I put and this is a 3-lead EMG where I did 3-lead EMG on the masseter and temporalis, and I took a piece of plastic and I bit really hard, molar to molar, then bicuspid to bicuspid, then canine to canine, then lateral to lateral, then central to central. What I would like you to appreciate is not just the reduction from molar to central of being 70%. I'd like you to notice that the peak of muscle activity of a canine is actually very close to the trough in the EMG muscle activity of a molar. Canines are still at about 70% muscle activity and can cause quite a bit of destruction. So looking at this appliance here, we can see the appliance at delivery, and I'm not super proud of that appliance on the left, but that is my appliance, one of the very first ones I ever made back in, I think, about 2000 at the Pankey Institute. But the right side appliance is not the same appliance, but it is a very similar appliance after 8 years of consistent wear by the patient. Why did he wear it? Because he wanted to protect his teeth. And he was actually going away on mission to Africa. I saw him after he came back, and you can see that all the destruction that he performed on the appliance kept his teeth safe. So palliative, protective, diagnostic, in his case, very much protective. And I am not showing videos tonight, but here's sort of a look at some screen captures of my video when we put a full arch appliance in and the patient is in MIP and they can go forward into protrusive. That's where they're going to be at 30% muscle activity. And they can go into right lateral. And there you can see that the canine is no longer touching. So canine initiated disclusion at 70% muscle activity. And then you can see that she has picked up the contacts on the central incisors, which drop that down to 30%. Again, same thing on the left lateral. And you can see that we have a smooth transition from that canine to the central incisors. I'd also like you to notice that this appliance is very, very flat because all of the condylar movement is influenced by the angle of the eminence slope up in the temporomandibular joint and fossa. that we don't necessarily need these huge ramps and these huge resistance places in front of the teeth. And here I'll show you one more animation of actually a lower appliance so you can see the same effect that it had as that upper appliance before. So in goes, just hit on the front teeth, the joint seats. Then we have distribution throughout the arch, tap, tap. And then as the patient goes into protrusive, 30% muscle activity. And as they go into lateral obtrusive, 70% transitioned to that 30% muscle activity. One of the diagnostic aspects, and this is one of my later appliances, much more of a Tanner style, incredibly thin, incredibly comfortable for the patient, that as they started out in MIP, and as we adjusted the appliance, and as that condyle was not in a seated position, through those adjustments and through that occlusal journey and experience for the patient, we're able to allow the joint to seat. Now, we may or may not want that joint to seat, and I'll talk about that in my last point this evening. But as we get there, all of those dots and lines have different appearances. So in the anterior bite plane, you might have just a 3 to 3, that is canine to canine or bicuspid to bicuspid, and you have 70% muscle activity transition to 30%. You may have an NTI style appliance that some call a cheater appliance, and that's just fine. But we start at just 30% muscle activity, and we're always just at 30% muscle activity, and that can be a fantastic appliance in two ways. It can be protective because all you're doing is hitting plastic. It can be palliative because the muscle activity is down at 30%. And it can also be a diagnostic because it allows the condyle to seat without the need of adjusting posterior contacts. So here you'll see that we put in a Lucia jig, or rather a Pankey deprogrammer, and without having to adjust any of the posterior acrylic, when that goes in, we're at 30% muscle activity, and we can go to that seated joint position. One of my personal favorites is, and I did not invent this, but I did name it just to genericize it, a dual arch anterior scribe appliance. That it is an appliance that is upper and lower, bicuspid to bicuspid. The lower has just a simple scribe, and the upper has a flat plate of acrylic. This is fantastic, just like the previous animation, as it allows the condyle to seat if you want. It is also fantastic as it is purely plastic to plastic, and that there are no teeth contacting. And then finally, it can be palliative in a fantastic way because it knocks that muscle activity down. And there you see a DASA and the black magic marks. I know this is going to come up in the question and answer, so I just want to go over this in advance. Anterior midpoint stop appliances, NTIs, DASAs, do they cause super eruption of the posterior teeth? No, not unless they're worn 24/7. It is really just a seating of the condyle. Do AMPSs cause intrusion of the anterior teeth? I've seen that when we just have a midpoint stop plastic against opposing, and over time I can see that happen. That's where I move to the DASA, which has plastic covering bicuspid to bicuspid. Will they become dislodged and aspirated? I'll tell you, it's only happened on one person in my entire 20-year career of using these, and that unfortunately was my sister. I have amazing retention with these, just the same way we do with temporary crowns. And it's not like we're not going to do temporary crowns. I'm certainly not going to do not do anterior only appliances. The last one I think which is valid is, do they cause undue loading of the joint? Dr. Nietzsche and Dolwick showed that a full arch appliance reduces upper joint space load by 80%. And some people will say, aha, there, if you only have an anterior appliance, it will increase joint space load. Well, you'll also have to balance that with, we're not at 100% muscle activity. And I've talked to Dr. Dolwick and I've talked to Dorit Nietzsche, and both of them say, based on their study, you cannot say that an anterior midpoint stop appliances will increase joint load. It has been shown to only in mathematical models, but not in the way that they did their studies. So whether it's a Pankey deprogrammer, or whether it is a Lucia jig, or whether it is a Coyce appliance, these are all accepted appliances that have been around honestly since the 50s. The Cois appliance you will find in textbooks. It wasn't called a Cois appliance, but it was in textbooks back as far as 1958, as I have seen. Luciajig, Victor Lucia, the Pankey deprogrammer, all of those have been around for decades and decades and decades. And anterior appliances have really not been so scary since so many people have been using them, advocating them, even at all of the major teaching institutes, including Pankey, Dawson, Spear, and Cois. As restorative dentists, though, our greatest challenge is just simply force management. Just the same way we have dots and lines on our appliances, we can have those dots and lines in our occlusion. Now, here's an appliance that has dots and has lines, but has no anterior contact. And if I circle that, you can see that this design was protective, I guess, in that it protected the anterior teeth because they're not touching at all. But as you can see, there's absolutely no wear in the anterior. And all of that posterior wear that you see is actually the patient closing on the dots, and all of the red lines are that patient in motion. And as they move around, here they are at nearly 100% muscle activity. And with that high muscle activity, we run into interferences. And this is the same patient that actually had the previous appliance. All of those things that we deal with are really about compression, and that is load and shear. We want distribution and load. We want reduction in shear or in motion. Here, because of the previous appliance design, where we see that the patient was clipping and catching at that high level of muscle activity, she unfortunately not only fractured the first molar crown, the cusp that you can see on the palatal there of the second molar is actually fractured and loose. And she's even actually fractured the porcelain off of the second bicuspid. So all of those have to do with resistance to motion. So we want to get our contacts as anteriorized as possible, as quickly as possible. And if we have an appliance, we want the plastic to take the abuse and not the teeth. So going through all that, you can see here on this appliance, which is very similar actually to these teeth, is as the patient lost anterior guidance and as the patient moved around on this splint, you can see that the canines have started to groove in the anteriors. Anterior guidance has started to groove, and as they made those grooves, they started to pick up the posterior wear. And I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but I'm looking on the left side of the screen at the first bicuspid, second bicuspid, and then you can see all the marks on the molars. And like the previous porcelain crown, that fracture now is on the plastic, and it goes all the way from second molar all the way up. And you can see that certainly on the right side of the screen that we have a fracture in the first and second molar area. So the temporalis master, those are the killer, crusher, destroyers of dentistry. And the lateral pterygoid is the accomplice. That's the mover. So in conjunction with the temporalis and the masseter in contraction, the lateral pterygoid moves the mandible around, and that's where we see the force of temporalis masseter, and we see the resistance of the lateral pterygoid. So second to last, I'd like to talk a little bit about records. So growing up in an analog world, everything was impressions, everything was face-bows, everything was sent off to the lab. And certainly scanning today is the reality for the vast majority, growing majority of people. So if we want to look at a CR fabricated orthotic, and we want to get records so that we can have this sort of approach, and so that everything then goes into protrusive, or we can elect to do an MIP fabricated orthotic, and we will have the benefits and considerations of that. So not having video tonight, I do have a leaf gauge record here. So I have basically added enough leaves until I have adequate thickness and clearance in the back of the mouth. that is I can screen to first contact, which I'm going to talk about in the final section. But this is for the records. I just keep adding leaves, have the patient slide forward, slide back, and then I can see that I maybe want 2, maybe 3 millimeters of room in the back. If you want more, if you want less, that's fine. But at this point, after we squirt the bite registration on both sides, we can actually go ahead and do our analog impressions, face, bow, protrusive, or we can do a scan. Now, how would I do the scan? And some people will say, well, just use the scan with the leaf gauge in. I'm not super comfortable with that because I'm worried about the patient moving. So what I would do is I have that left bite registration in, and I have that left and right bite registration. What I would do is I'd take out the right side, have them close into the left side bite. I would scan the right side with a buccal bite. Then I would put the right bite registration in and scan the left side. So if we're really looking at what we want for recommended records, one is leaf gauge screen all orthotic patients for for risk of an anterior open bite. That is just informed consent, and I'll tell you the worst anterior open bite I have ever seen was from a full arch appliance where the patient just damaged it and their condyle kept seating. So full arch impression and scan for any of the anterior midpoint stop appliances is fine. The AMSA, the DASA, the B splint, the Cois appliance. For CR splints, at a minimum, you need full arch records and a CR bite taken at the desired vertical dimension. Traditional records, the face bow, the protrusive, all of those can help minimize your chair side adjustments. Are they absolutely mandatory? I'm going to have to say no, because a lot of our digital software is not able to use them. So always provide an AM aligner, and I'm going to go over that. If no occlusal changes are desired, patient can decide whether they want to wear it. And MIP only records may be fine, but can lead to additional adjustments. So let's get to that last part that I started to really talk about, is let's talk about screening for that anterior open bite. So screening with a leaf gauge can help you see if you're going to lose restorative room on a second molar on the left side of the screen. It can help you see if how the patient is going to seat, if you might open up restorative room in the anterior. But tonight I'd really just like to focus on the possibility of an anterior open bite, and that can happen with pain patients or non-pain patients. So using a leaf gauge, and this one's from Great Lakes Orthodontics, you can also get these from Panadent and several other companies. Now the leaf gauge from Great Lakes is going to be 8 leaves equals 1 millimeter. Now with that 3-to-1 ratio, not real important for the anterior open bite, but I'm going to go over that. If the patient is an MIP and not at a fully seated position, and we start to put a leaf gauge in between their teeth, and we can say close in your back teeth, and they're still hitting. We keep adding leaves, and we say try to slide forward, back, try to close on your back teeth. They're still hitting. At some point, when we add enough leaves, we will remove the influence of the teeth and the condyle will seat. When we get to that point and we increase leaves until no teeth are touching, and then take the leaves back off so that just that first tooth or that CO contact is touching, that is our screen for an anterior open bite. So looking at that, 3 in the front, 1 in the back, 3-to-1 ratio. This is sort of what this is going to look like when we go through this process of the joint seating, when you actually see the condyle seat. So here you're going to see a lot of leaves. There'll be way enough leaves to separate the teeth to allow the temporalis and the masseter to force seat the condyle to the seated position or the centric relation position. And I'll let that scroll through a few times so that you can kind of just have a little bit of a look-see on there. And what you can see is we can add a lot of leaves and get to a seated joint position, and then we can take that bite registration when there's enough room. But you can also see that red dot that starts to show up on that second molar, and that is that recording of that CO or first contact. So as I go through this with a patient, specifically with pain patients, I used to have 20% of my practice as a pain referral practice, but pain is subjective. There are some people that may have symptoms, but they don't admit it. It doesn't bother them. It doesn't mean that they still might not be at risk of seating. So when I have the pain patient or any orthotic patient, are they at risk? Are they informed? So on the left side of the screen, you see a patient in MIP and her teeth are all the way together, but she is not happy. Why is she not happy? She has an extreme pain on her lateral pterygoids and on her temporalis. This is what she looked like after orthotic therapy. Now, this is actually a little bit of a story because that's how she presented to me. And when she came to me, I said, she had broken her Tanner appliance, that is her lower full arch appliance, and she was getting back in pain. And I made her a new appliance, anterior only appliance, that reduced her muscle activity, and she really didn't care about her anterior open bite. There are people that are in such severe pain that they don't care until they do. There was a point that Barbara did start to care because she had functional concerns, but regardless of that, regardless of your own personal preferences, of your own personal bias of whether that would bother you. These are patients when I was in a heavy pain practice that were on narcotics. They were throwing up all the time. They weren't pleasant to be around. They were missing work. They were missing their kids' school. But the question I ask them when I go through that leaf gauge screen, I said, is it more important for you? And I'll say, is it more important for you to get rid of the pain, or is it more important for you for your bite not to end up like this? There are generally three answers that I have gotten. My bite like that, I don't care. Help me. And then the second one, my bite like that, no thanks. I'll just take some ibuprofen, some 420, some vodka, some whatever, some Flexeril, and they'll self-medicate or just work with meds. And then the other person, which could be Dave or it could be Barbara, if you can get rid of my pain and my bite ends up like this, can you help me? These are typical patients that we saw back then in post-orthotic therapy with anterior open bites because we weren't doing something that we are actually doing today. Now, my wife has a diplomate in sleep medicine, so her concern tends to be posterior open bites because she has patients that are held in protrusion. If we have these type of appliances, we can have patients that seat and we get anterior open bites. So informing them beforehand is informed consent. When we tell them afterwards, it's an excuse. I referred to that at the beginning of the webinar that I was actually a defense witness for anterior open bites. And the deciding factor in every case where the defendant won was when they had informed the patient of the anterior open bite. We had these patients that were coming in that said, I said, why did you go see Dr. Melkers? Said, well, I was in pain. And what were your expectations of Dr. Melkers? Well, I wanted Dr. Melkers to get me out of pain. Okay, and did Dr. Melkers get you out of pain? Yes, he got me out of pain. You went to Dr. Melkers to get out of pain and he got you out of pain 100% to your satisfaction. Yes. Why are you suing Dr. Melkers? He didn't tell me about the anterior open bite. So can we prevent the anterior open bite? Yes. And one of the ways that we do this, and this is what I used to use, an AM aligner, which is a thermoplastic wafer. And before we start orthotic therapy, we actually heat it, warm it, it gets very squishy, and we have the patient bite into MIP. These were nice when they're the only thing we had, but during COVID, I actually saw some people lose these, break these, and develop anterior open bites. So one of my favorite materials actually for an AM aligner is actually Futar Clear Fast from Kettenbach. I have no financial disclosure I'm not paid by any company. The thing I really love about the Futar Clear Fast though is it has a Shore A hardness of 62. It is super rigid, doesn't have as much of the bite registration can be. And what we have here is an AM aligner that is fabricated in MIP before the patient starts their orthotic therapy. You can see that they're retracted. So when they take their DASA or they take their Tanner out in the morning, what they do is they wear this, they wear it for about 5 minutes. I frequently recommend they wear it in the shower. So if the orthotic provides palliative or protective benefits, but we don't want any bite changes to happen. The AM aligner helps patients maintain themselves in MIP. So CR fabricated or MIP fabricated orthotic, this can be a lifesaver. So Lauren, I'd have to say I was very happy with myself. I hit 45 minutes exactly on the button. We went through all of these learning objectives that I hope was a little different approach, perhaps a little different than you thought tonight would be. But I'd like to thank Dr. Levine for hosting me and starting us off. I'd like to thank Burbank Dental Lab for having me. And my email is down there at the bottom, info@michaelmelkers.com. If there's something that you didn't think of or there's something that you're wondering about, please feel free to shoot me an email. I will tell you, if I'm too busy, I just flat out won't answer. But it always makes my heart warm that we were able to benefit a sharing of knowledge. I am just simply passing along things that were shared with me over the years, and I'd like to thank all of you, several hundred of you, for showing up this evening.